The easiest thing for a startup is getting started. A corporate innovator cannot succeed if they don't collaborate quite closely with the key functions.
What I usually do is before I talk about how to change mindset, I try to really create a shared understanding with my clients what mindset actually is.
Companies don't run themselves, right? It's the people in the companies that run those companies. To what extent are they committed to the notion that you navigate concepts from idea to scalable, profitable business model? If you want to change people's behavior, give them a way that's easy to do that. The job of the innovation team or the innovation lead is to protect that small person in the corner of the future lab, not by fighting for them when things go wrong, but by creating pre-agreements with all these functions. If I won't give you any money until you promise me a return, that's a blocker for innovation, because a person really doing breakthrough innovation doesn't know the return.
Hello and welcome to our next episode of the Agile Insights Conversation. Today I'm hosting a good friend, Tendayi Viki. He's based out of Zimbabwe, and Tendayi and I met 4 years ago before COVID at a Strategyzer bootcamp, and I was fascinated by the session he ran at the bootcamp, the conversations we had around lunch, and ever since then, we've stayed in touch, and I was very delighted to host him for today's conversation. So Tendayi, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man. Really appreciate. And it was great to hang out at the bootcamp back when people were allowed to get together. Now that bootcamp is completely virtual, right? It's a virtual bootcamp now.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I mean, people have seen that it can work out virtual, but if I could choose, I probably would want that bootcamp to be on site, in person again, because exactly. I think in the virtual space, you and I wouldn't have connected the way we connected. It was like those lunches that we had and so on and so forth. Yeah, now, Tendayi, as I usually do at the start of the show, I would like to give you the stage to briefly present what you've done so far, who you are. I know you're the author of many books, so walk us through that.
Tendayi Viki, at the moment, associate partner at Strategyzer. So I work with Alex Osterwalder and team there. And we help large companies implement their innovation systems, processes, culture. We coach teams to work on their innovation projects. I've also written 3 books, The Corporate Startup, which has won several awards. Then I wrote The Lean Product Lifecycle, which is based off work that I did at Pearson, working with the team there to implement the product lifecycle, which is a framework. It actually won a couple of awards, that framework too, in terms of like best innovation process, best innovation culture. And then my latest book, Pirates in the Navy, which is a play on Steve Jobs. It's more fun to be a pirate than to join the Navy. But if you're thinking about being a corporate innovator, then you kind of have to be a pirate in the Navy to make that work. And so I kind of think of the chief innovation officer, the innovation lead, the innovation teams inside large organizations as my tribe. Those are my people. And so that's who I try and serve in the work that I do and in the thinking and writing and workshops and consulting, etc.
Yeah. And over the past years, you have worked with companies, if I'm informed correctly, out of many different industries, like pharmaceuticals and so on and so forth. And throughout this conversation, hopefully we can get some of those insights from you. And I know you have NDAs with many of those companies. So the people that are watching the show, don't be mad if we cannot name the company, but we'll definitely name the industry, because sometimes the challenges are very industry specific. In other cases, many organizations are facing the same challenges. Mm-hmm. So, Tendayi, as you mentioned, the 3 books that you wrote, the Lean Product Lifecycle, the Corporate Startup, and then finally Pirates in the Navy, which was also illustrated by a shared friend of ours, Holger Niels Boll. Yeah. All of them are around the topic of corporate innovation. You yourself worked at Pearson at some point, were part of the internal innovation team. And what made you focus on this particular topic? Because so many other people in this space talk about innovation holistically or in general, or sometimes even with a clear focus on startups. But corporate innovation is different from that. What made you focus on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's not something I intended. It was more by accident. It was never a deliberate choice that I was going to work on corporate innovation. I thought I was going to be advising startup accelerators. And that was my intended career. Like I started working with, because I'm a former academic, right? I used to teach at university. And then I got a fellowship to go work at Stanford in Silicon Valley for a while. And it was in 2009, 2010, around the time the Lean Startup book was about to come out. Business model, the business model generation book had just come out by Alex Osterwalder. Steve Blank was running classes at Stanford, and I used to go to all those classes. And I used to hang out at the Facebook accelerator, where Lyft was actually part of that Facebook accelerator, the ride sharing company. And back then they were called Zimride. And I remember approaching the founder going, "Why do you call your company Zimride?" And he goes, "Because I was in Zimbabwe, which is where I'm from, and I saw how like there's these cars that pick up people along the way, these taxis that pick up people along the way. People share the ride all the way into the city." And so he named the company Zimride. They then changed it to Lyft later. But again, it was interesting just to see those themes to sort of show up. So that was like my first exposure to startup culture, lean startup methodologies, etc. And then I just started hanging out at startup accelerators. That's where I used to spend most of my time and teach, hang out, do lean startup methods, talk about lean startup. I did a lot of the work, a lot of work at Rockstar Accelerator, which is in Amsterdam. And I was part of a lean startup machine. That's what I used to do. And then at one of those times when I was talking about lean startup, there was a character in the audience by the name of Craig Strong. And Craig Strong was part of the Pearson's innovation team, where they were trying to set up innovation practices at Pearson, and they wanted to use lean startup and agile. So he invited me in the first instance just to give a keynote at Pearson on lean startup. And that's what I did. I went over there and I gave a keynote. And in the audience of that keynote was Sonia Krsajovic, who was leading that innovation team. And then she was like, "Well, come work with us for a little while. Just give us advice on like what we're thinking about doing." Mm-hmm. And then like it turned out we collaborated so well that I ended up joining them. I took a sabbatical from my university and I joined them. Ended up quitting my job and joining Pearson. And then I ended up working there for like 5 years, helping implement this sort of process. But because I come from an academic background, everything we did there, I would think about, how is this repeatable elsewhere? Like, is there like a pattern here? Is there? And that's what led to the corporate startup book, right, which I was working on with Dan Thoma, who was in a similar kind of situation at Deutsche Telekom, where he was working on innovation too. And so, because I enjoyed the work so much, I didn't go looking for it. I ended up enjoying it so much at Pearson, then advising other companies, did some work for Standard Bank in South Africa, because I enjoyed it so much. That's how the choice was made, mm-hmm. to then go deeper into this practice rather than just sort of skim the surface and then go do something else. Yeah.
Okay. So more or less by accident, you stumbled into Pearson.
Yes.
Now, when you joined Pearson, what was the challenge that they wanted to solve? What kind of pattern did you recognize there as a scientist, basically, as an academic, that you later also saw at many other organizations?
Yeah, so at first, when I first joined, I was confused. Like I was completely lost. Like I didn't quite get like where I was. We were just figuring it out. But what we were trying to solve for was that the way companies make investment decisions and plan to execute on innovations is exactly the same methodology and toolbox they use to run their core business. Mm-hmm. So if you're working on something new, you have to write a 30-page business case and then convince the company to give you millions of dollars. And then you go off and you execute against the roadmap that you stated. And what we were saying was, is there a way to, what do you call it when you're sticking something in front of something? Like to rig or gerrymander or like, I don't know, like stick at the front of that a testing process. Mm-hmm. So that before you have to make the big investment decision, is there a way of like learning what customers need, creating prototypes, testing those prototypes, learning whether the business model has got legs, and then you can double down in investment. So we were like figuring that out, like what would that look like? And we didn't even have at Pearson a distinct innovation unit. So what we were doing was we were convincing business unit by business unit by business unit to take up this methodology we were calling the lean product lifecycle. And the reason we called it the product lifecycle was because we had idea, explore, validate, and then we would cut it off and then we'd go, now you can go into growth, which is what you do after you launch, sustaining, and retiring. So the growth, sustain, retire is what the core business does anyway. And so we had added this left side to the life cycle to see whether or not this was actually going to work. And because there was no innovation function, we were working quite hard to convince already existing decision-making bodies and leadership and product teams to adopt this methodology and add this new toolbox to the way that they were already working. And it was hard, but we had quite a bit of success, to the extent that we won a couple of awards. And a couple of folks that used to work at Pearson that now work in other businesses keep calling me in to help them in those businesses to bring the same methodology that we did at Pearson. So it had some impact there. And that's where I figured out that kind of pattern recognition thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, you started off with talking about investment decisions, right? And corporations, you're usually looking at, you need to present a business case that needs to be a big one. And then we commit a high, like a huge amount of budget to that initiative. And because it's a huge amount of budget, we cannot do that many of this. Now, I remember from what you mentioned earlier, you used to hang out at the startup accelerators. Their approach is completely different, right? And I assume now you were able to connect some of those things and try to convince people within Pearson to adopt those principles of like investing smaller amounts to test ideas. Like David Blandko has a whole book around testing business ideas, reduce uncertainty around value, viability, etc. And then based on that, go into grow, sustain, and ultimately retire. Is that where you took a lot of inspiration from?
So here's the funny thing about it, right? All these words you're using and all this language that you have now, that didn't exist 8-9 years ago when we were working on this. Like there was no David Bland writing books on testing business ideas. The lean startup methodology was just emerging. We used to call them MVPs, right? But nobody really had a 44 experiment toolbox. There was no, the only thing we knew was people should be testing their ideas before they scale their ideas. And what we thought is like, okay, well, what should they be testing? Then we started coming up with these like thoughts around, well, they should be testing whether there's a customer need. They should be testing whether or not the price point resonates. They should be testing. And it was all around the business model, the work that Alex had done. That's where we kind of got the inspiration from to say, what should they be testing? And then, of course, you're right. Looking at the startup ecosystem gave us this idea that rather than make one big bet, you should be making incremental bets. Something that Eric Ries later called metered funding. When we were at Pearson 4 or 5 years earlier, we were just calling it incremental funding. We didn't have a language for it. And so we then got into like thinking, okay, well, if we're saying incremental funding like startups, what does that look like from a finance standpoint? And Sonia Krasevich was leading the team. She was remarkable in the sense of her tenacity in never like bending, trying to make sure that we do the right things consistently. And she set up a process where we engaged with finance, the senior vice presidents of finance, the CFO, et cetera. And we came to this agreement that maybe in the early stages, we should be spending £50,000 on customer discovery and maybe another 150,000 on business model, prototype, product discovery, whatever. And that became, and zero on the idea stage. And that became the agreement that we made that was then publicized company-wide through this. And from that, I learned this principle that a corporate innovator cannot succeed if they don't collaborate quite closely with the key functions that are going to be involved in making decisions about the innovation. How much money should it get? Should it be allowed to scale, etc.? To such an extent that there was an insight that Craig Strong, who was part of the team there, came up with this concept of creating what he called a knowledge network, where colleagues from different functions would make a contribution to the design of the product lifecycle. So legal and compliance, security. At Pearson, it was an education company, so we had the feasibility test around the quality of the pedagogy of the product. Like, does it really deliver the value? So there was a team there that was part of that. And so how do we measure all those things as we develop the product, and what are the criteria for each one of those stages that we had in the product lifecycle? And that knowledge network, Craig ended up calling it PI, was again another principle that I took away from that experience to say, okay, so you can bring all these people together, and then as a corporate innovator, you don't have to hide away and run a guerrilla movement and try and duck and dive. You can actually really build a collaborative thing, which, 8 years, 10 years later, Alex Osterwalder and I now call it the bridge to the core, the bridge between the innovation team and the core business. And it's an assessment that we have in a tool. But again, it's all built up of these small experiences that we were having of having to solve problems as they emerged and try to be as creative as possible in a corporate innovation practice that wasn't really well developed at the time.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned that you had to convince a lot of people because you didn't have a distinct innovation unit back then at Pearson. And you used a lot of hey, you already know growth, sustain, and retire, but we're adding something to that. How important was it from your perspective, now in hindsight, that you used terminology and concepts that they were familiar with and built on top of that?
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's something that I keep doing, right? So recently we were working with a large American manufacturing company, the package manufacturer, and they had a really clear process because they're an R&D driven organization. So they had a real clear process for when something emerges from R&D and we think we want to scale it, then we have a commercialization path, right? And the commercialization path is make the business case, create the roadmap, we approve the roadmap, you start executing on the roadmap, then we have checkpoints, and then we launch, right? And then we said, okay, you can keep that, but let's take that process that you already have and all the things you want in the business case. Because in the business case, they wanted to know the customers, how much they're willing to pay. They wanted to know all this information before they would make the decision. But the team that was completing the business case was doing it all based on assumptions.
Yes, of course.
They never got a chance to go and find out. So rather than just ask the questions on the final day where you have to make decisions, is there a way of stretching out the decision-making process so you're making smaller and smaller decisions? So we take the same things you want to ask and we just say, these 3 things are part of an earlier phase. These other 5 things are part of a later phase. And in the end, the team is building that final business case systematically over time, and you get a chance to stop things before they spend too much. So we ended up showing them almost like a puzzle that ends up with this exact same business case that they want, but it's a validated business case, not a made-up business case. And then the team can move into roadmap execution. We didn't change much of that later process because it's a validated business case. And so that really matters, because I think one of the earliest mistakes I made in my career when I first started was to trash what people are doing, to say, nah, man, you need to be more like Facebook. Can't you see what Google is doing? And all of these things. But actually, a lot of the processes that exist inside large organizations are usually there for a reason. There have been some experiences that have led them to create those boundaries, and to honor that and then create a process that collaborates well is the best way for a corporate entrepreneur to really operate. Yeah.
You mentioned to honor that. I also agree that you need to appreciate what these organizations have done in order to stay in business for that period of time or grow tremendously. Last week, I was working with a company that is 403 years old.
Wow.
I mean, of course, they can learn a lot from Amazon and Google and Apple, etc. But none of these companies that I just mentioned is 403 years old. So this company has had to do a lot of things right in order to stay in business for such a long period of time and stay in business as an independent company. They're still family owned, right? It's not like they've been passed from one company to the other and one different owner. Still family owned, continuous growth over many decades, even centuries. So I think appreciating what they've done and then building on top of that is really important. And to add to the other thing that you mentioned, I used to do the same thing, right? Come in and use a lot of terminology that these companies were not familiar with. But what I realized is that just creates confusion. And if there's confusion, it's very difficult to take people along on this journey. And
Yes.
without buy-in from the key functions and support from the key functions, as you mentioned, right? If you can't bridge this gap to the core, you're not going to get very far, even if you have a distinct innovation unit.
Yeah.
Now, let's move from your time at Pearson and some of the patterns that you recognized back then to the work that you've done in the past 5, 6, 7 years, where you worked with many different organizations. And I want to now go back to the initial question. What are some of the biggest challenges that you have seen at organizations in various industries? And maybe if there is an industry specific challenge, for example, in pharma or medtech, because they are so highly regulated, I'd also like to explore that with you.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that are almost like first principle philosophy
Mm.
that are kind of universally true. And the first thing that's universally true is that like companies don't run themselves, right? It's the people in the companies that run those companies. And it's how they view the world that impacts the decisions that they make. And then, of course, how they view the world is usually informed by the successes that they've had. It's very difficult to tell an individual who's had repeated success doing a particular thing that somewhere in that success hides their future failure. Like, that's a hard thing to wrap your head around. So that's the first, like, almost like the human condition of complacency after success, you know? It's, you're kind of grappling with leaders that make 20 times my annual income in just their bonus, and I'm trying to convince them that they just made 10 million last year personally, and somehow they're looking at failure. It's a hard psychological leap to take people along to. So that's already like sitting there in the background. Feeding that is the existing rituals and practices that the company already has that people are used to using to do their work. So the cadence of meetings they have, how the board works, how investment decision making is done, how products are created, how they deal with manufacturers, how they deal with their value chain, how legal and compliance is really paying attention to make sure the brand doesn't get damaged or nobody sues them or no customer gets hurt or like all of those things that they have in place. The sales director who's running a large sales team and doesn't want anybody else to talk to customers but them because they're protecting those relationships. And so all of those things are there in an institutional form as practices that are reinforcing the human condition for never seeing failure hidden in the success. And so when you're stepping into that environment where the context is feeding the psychology and you're trying to introduce a new tool, it is really difficult, right? It's a hard conversation to have. And another thing that made it difficult in the early stages was that innovation people or innovators or entrepreneurs, we spoke a lot about mindset. And we really focus on convincing people to change their mindsets without giving them a toolbox with which to practice those mindset changes. And so you're in there and you do your business model workshop or whatever. And then when the person goes back to their company, they can't do any of those things because when they sit at their desk, the tools that they have to do the work are core business tools. So it's a mixture of all of those things, which ultimately results in this outcome, which is the third first principle, which is the tools, practices, mindsets, behaviors for running the core business are what is being used to launch new products and services. Because those are easy things to reach for and use, easy to reach for and use. Which typically results in an organization never being able to really do breakthrough innovation, which is too far away from the business model. Because if you have to write a business case, it starts to bring you back to the things you already know. So absolutely. Most companies are really great at incremental innovations, kind of just tinkering around the edges of what they already do. And so it's a self-reinforcing thing. Right? Incremental innovations are much more likely to produce immediate results. Transformative innovations are 5-year, 10-year plays with no revenue, and so it's a completely different way of thinking. And I just want to wrap up by saying that if you're a corporate innovator and a corporate entrepreneur, you run into certain stumbling blocks. So you say, the sales guy won't let me do this, or legal and compliance won't approve my experiment. And for you, those individual things are those are symptoms. The bigger thing is that the engine that's sitting behind that, from the mindsets of the leaders, experiences they have, the human complacency, and then the cultural practices, rituals, and artifacts that the organization uses to run itself. And so the things you then stumble into are just outcomes of those. And if you try and deal with each individual outcome by itself without really thinking about all these bigger picture things, you'll keep running into different things every time you try and launch a new innovation project.
And this is really deep. And if I remember correctly, you're a psychologist by background, right?
Yes, that's what my PhD is.
Because like if I would talk to Alex and he goes deep on these things too, I don't think he would have this psychologist view on this topic, or many other people. Now, you mentioned a few things that I wrote down immediately. You talked about mindset, and that people go out, like innovation consultants like you and I, right? We go out and we talk a lot about mindset, and this needs to be changed, but it is super hard to change it. But before what I usually do is, before I talk about how to change mindset, I try to really create a shared understanding with my clients what mindset actually is. What is mindset for you, Tendayi?
Yeah, so for me, and this is the first time I've been asked this question, so I'm having to formulate an answer on the spot. But for me, I think mindsets are all the frameworks, assumptions, archetypes that sit in our head that are the filter for reality. Mm-hmm. So as reality comes to us, it's because perception is different from, right? So the way we perceive the world is filtered through these mindsets, which are these archetypes, prototypes, these assumptions, everything we think we know about the world. And so we want to challenge people in terms of everything they think they know about the world and how the world works. And a lot of the time, I've actually discovered that there's very few people that disagree with me when I challenge the idea that you can't scale something without knowing what the customer wants. Like, that makes sense to a lot of people. Like, I've never met a single leader that goes, I don't care what the customer wants, I'm going to just give them anything. Right? People that would just sound absurd. You can't really set the pricing without testing the customer sensitivity to the price. You can't build a product. Like, all these things make sense, and people agree with you. And then they turn around to start to try and do the work, and there's no tool in the environment that is an expression of that mindset. Mm. So they end up stuck using tools. So even if they agree with you, they end up stuck using tools that are still an instantiation of the previous mindset.
Yeah. So I agree with almost everything that you mentioned. I would add on top of that, I think. So usually when I ask my workshop participants, right, what is mindset? Because they bring up like, oh, this person that they don't have an agile mindset. So what is mindset? Like, yeah, that's how people think. Okay. So how do you judge someone's mindset? Right? Even with the best medical devices, we cannot assess what that person is thinking. Then I judge their actions. I'm like, okay. So, right, at least one part of mindset is how do people behave? And I think what you mentioned, right, these frameworks that we have in our mind, how we perceive the world, and based on that, how we act is then ultimately the mindset that we have. And I think now when we talk about changing this mindset, you mentioned earlier, people didn't have the tools, etc., available to do things differently. Now, if we want them to do things differently, we need to provide concrete ideas, concrete tools, concrete ways of doing things differently. And the better we package those things, I think the easier we make it for those people that we want to help to change their mindset by doing things now differently. And I think one of the values that Strategyzer and many of the other people like David Bland and etc. add, is making those tools so simple to use that it becomes something, even if they're not that familiar with, that they can start experimenting with. And by going through the business model canvas, you start thinking about all of these different building blocks. And then you realize, oh, all of these things that I put in here are assumptions. And now you're like, okay, what I've learned is I have to test my assumptions. So what is the next step? And by the way, here is a 44 toolbox book with all the things that I can do to test the different assumptions out of those different building blocks. So providing those things is really a catalyst in helping people to change their mindsets.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Go ahead.
And just remember this, right? That the human mind is fungible in terms of how it makes connections. But the human mind cannot make those connections and strengthen those connections without embodying, like actually embodying and acting out the thinking, right? So I agree completely that a person needs to be physically fit, and I can agree on a whole bunch of stuff. But if I don't embody it and manifest it, if it doesn't become a habit of work. What you don't want to do as you become an expert or a practitioner of a certain thing is have to think too hard about something before you do it. Yeah. And the only way you don't have to think too hard about something before you do it is repetitions where you're embodying that practice. And the way to embody something is to take the mindset and turn it into rituals and artifacts. So when we say in Agile, let's have a 15-minute stand-up where we talk about these specific things, it's a ritual. We're embodying something. If we say, let's have a demo day, it's a ritual. We're embodying something. If we say all of those things become expressions of the manifesto. But if all we had was the manifesto, it would be really hard to get the practice into the organization. And so it's a really important part of creating change in an organization, because a lot of the assumptions that underlie the tools that we traditionally use, people have already forgotten what the assumptions are that underlie those tools. We now just use them out of habit, but actually as we use them, we're expressing assumptions that the person who created the tool had, or philosophies and beliefs they had, and we don't even know that that's what we're doing. And so you want to change people's behavior, give them a way that's easy to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, to build on top of that, I usually mention to my clients that the beauty of Scrum as an example is that it's a habit building framework, right? It helps you embody a lot of the things that will help you ultimately reduce your uncertainty in a more systematic way, in a faster way, right? Other than that, you can change everything around it, right? But start embodying those things, start building those habits. The other thing I picked up as you were speaking earlier was the topic of culture. You're referring to if you're like a corporate innovator and you're trying to like deal with like individual things, but if you're not addressing the culture of the organization, probably, and this is what I'm saying or what I perceived, a lot of the energy that you're putting in will ultimately go to waste. So let's talk a bit about culture, because this is now looking at the broader thing, like corporate innovation. What are some of the cultural elements in many organizations, other than like the investment philosophy, etc., that make it difficult for breakthrough innovations to happen?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And well, one of my favorite things to say is like when people talk about innovation culture, or they talk about culture in general, they talk about culture as if it's like some sort of mysterious vibe that comes down from the mountains to bless the people. It's like, hey man, the vibe in here is off, it's like, but it's not a mysterious vibe that comes down from the mountains to bless the people. A culture of any community, any organization is really the things we celebrate, reward, or punish and kind of block. And so the fundamental question is like, what's in the soil of this organization, right? You want innovation as the plants to kind of come out. So when a flower fails to bloom, there's a quote from someone, I forget who, you don't start shouting at the flower. You say, bloom, 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 what's wrong with you? Change your mindset. Right? You start thinking about, is there something wrong with the soil? And are the nutrients in the soil off? And so culture is really the things that enable or block the behaviors that we want to see. So if I won't give you any money until you promise me a return, that's a blocker for innovation, because a person really doing breakthrough innovation doesn't know the return, doesn't even know the customer.
You can't promise anything.
They can't promise anything. But if the rule is you have to promise, then I'll give you funding, then the culture in that organization is we celebrate people that make promises by giving them funding. And we celebrate even more with bonuses, people that then deliver on those promises. Whereas in innovation, failure is part of the process. And so we don't celebrate people who fail because, first of all, we won't even, like, you made a promise and then you broke it. So you're not a great corporate citizen. But so I can't make the promise. And if I make it, I might break it. So now the enablement of my behavior is different. I was once working for a large sort of FTSE 100 organization where some intern person was working on some lean startup future lab thing, and they created a landing page to test whether customers like the value proposition. And they put an email to say, if you're interested, like, email us or whatever. And then they sent it out to all the customers on the database. And they didn't have the product or anything. But what happened was the customers that received this, they didn't use the email on the landing page. They called their salesperson, who they deal with every day, to say, I want this thing, it's cool. And the sales director didn't know that this experiment was going to happen. So you can imagine this poor intern, like, the weight of the company came down on them, like from the head of sales to the head of marketing to the legal and compliance. Like, how can you promise a value proposition we don't have to customers, to the CEO? And you're like this small person in the corner of a future lab, and everybody wants to know your name and like what you're doing. And so, like, and then everybody can see the trouble you got in, and that's our culture. Yeah. Great. And so the job of the innovation team or the innovation lead is to protect that small person in the corner of the future lab, not by fighting for them when things go wrong, but by creating pre-agreements with all these functions that when we're running experiments, you can anticipate that customers might call you. Just ask the customers to use the email on the thing, right? And then everything is okay, because that's the way you start evolving the culture. So it's really the things that enable or block the behaviors we want to see within the innovation teams that we have.
And I think this is a great example that you also provided, and it also shows where working on innovation in corporations is fundamentally different than in a startup. Because in a startup, I mean, if people start calling, everyone's like, yes, we have people's interest, right? Let's go and build something around it. Exactly. It might even be the CEO's idea to, like, email random people, like, this is our value proposition. But in an existing business where you have this reputation risk and not everybody has that mindset, right? Or is involved in this innovation and is also not incentivized by this innovation, right? This is another topic. Then you can run into a lot of resistance.
Exactly.
Now, as we've covered, I mean, there's so many other probably challenges and patterns that we can analyze and diagnose. But let's go into the solution space. How do you usually start your engagements with organizations that reach out and say, hey, Strategyzer, Tendayi, we want to become more innovative? Because as we can see, right, we really believe in what Alex is saying. Every business model is like yogurt in a fridge. At some point, it will expire. The difference is on the yogurt, there's an expiration date. On our business model, there's not. But we know it will expire at some point. Where do we start?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? I have two thoughts in the back of my mind that I don't say them explicitly always, but I use those two thoughts to gauge where the company is just early. And the first thought is, to what extent do they understand that innovation is different from creativity or invention?
Yeah.
To what extent do they understand that a successful innovation We judge something as a successful innovation to the extent that it's figured out the right customer, it's figured out the right business model, and is now out in the world having an impact. To what extent are they committed to the notion that you navigate concepts from idea to scalable, profitable business models? To what extent are they committed to that journey? Because sometimes we engage with organizations that are not committed to that journey. They're more committed to the innovation theater aspects. They want an idea jam, a hackathon, a lab where people hang out and there's speeches and pizza nights and all this stuff. But there's no real mandate for creating value at the end of the journey of these ideas.
Yeah.
And so if I pick up that there is no commitment, we then have the discussion of trying to agree that there should be that commitment, right? That's kind of like the initial conversation, because there's just as an ethics thing, it doesn't really work for us to get involved in like non-authentic practices of innovation. It's not a good thing for my brand or your brand, right? Or any of the practitioners that we know. And
it's
so,
also not a good investment of our time, right? Because
exactly.
in addition to making money, we want to have an impact, to have something that we can show and be proud of. Yeah,
exactly. So that's the first commitment. And then there's a second one, which a lot of people don't think about, which we think about a lot, which is, to what extent, so let's say we agree they're committed to going from idea to business model that works. Then the second question is, to what extent are they committed to making that process repeatable versus having each idea navigate its own path and nurse itself through all the obstacles by itself? And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say, for example, in one idea, the team wants to run an experiment with customers, but legal and compliance won't approve the experiment. Let's say the landing page that kid launched. There's two things you can do. One is you can negotiate as much as possible to get the legal and compliance folks to approve this one idea and help it pass through. You can do things like political influence, an ambassador, connections, meetings, whatever it is. And you have this idea go through, and then you can run experiments, whatever, et cetera, and then progress. And then that's it. You can leave it at that, right? The idea has gone through. Or you can ask yourself a question, which is the second path, which is, what do we now need to put in place so that the next idea that comes behind this idea doesn't have to answer this question again or suffer the same struggle? And that's the repeatable process. And so is it innovation as one-off projects that are nursed through all the obstacles whenever necessary? Or is it innovation as the early innovations are almost like explorers creating the roads that future innovation teams are going to walk on through the agreements, practices, tools that you've already made with all these key functions that these innovations run into as they're moving through the organization? So those are the two commitments. Are you committed to innovation authentically as idea to business? And are you committed to creating a repeatable process?
Which goes back to what you were early on looking at Pearson, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's where I learned. Is
that repeatable? Is that repeatable? So this is interesting. Go on. Sorry.
Exactly. So then we go, and then if we understand that those are the commitments, we're agreed on those two principles, then the question then becomes, okay, well, what are the obstacles? What are the things we need to lower down, accentuate, increase, et cetera, et cetera? And so there's two ways to do that. I often say to organizations, there's two ways to do it. We can do an official audit where we go through and we have a process. One question in the audit is a question we call the hero innovator, where we just find a young person in the organization and go, listen, if you had a breakthrough innovation that you needed to get started in the organization, what would you do? And then they start ooming and ahhing and telling us like all the hoops they have to jump through. Well, first I'd have to get my line manager to give me permission to get this form filled in for this. And so then we can say, okay, so those are the obstacles. And then we do a whole bunch of other forms of assessment. And so that's an official audit. In other organizations, the innovation team is under pressure to produce results from a product standpoint, a product services standpoint. So we say to them, okay, let's run innovation sprints, but use them as Trojan horses to surface the blockers. So let's collect 10 to 12 teams, put them in a cohort, launch them in the organization, and see what happens. But every time they run into an obstacle, we need to document that instead of thinking about ways of how to lower that. And so you get the benefit of both. You get the double whammy of running a proper idea through, but also learning about how your organization responds to innovation and starting to create a path for creating that repeatable process. So your question was, how do you start? So that's how we typically start, right? Working with companies.
Now, when you do that, you mentioned already like innovation department, etc. Who are the key people, especially in larger organizations, that you need to get on board?
Oh man! So the ones that
Because
are
we talked about the key functions earlier, right?
exactly. So I do a survey when I'm doing keynotes, and one of my questions is, which functions in your organizations are the hardest to work with when it comes to innovation? And the top three are finance, legal and compliance, and believe it or not, IT. It's very strange. I find IT very strange, but actually IT is with the backlogs and all these things that make people wait. So finance, legal, IT, HR. But finance is a really big one. Legal and compliance is a really big one. Then sales, because sometimes you need access to customers, right? And you need them to help you get access to customers. So sales is a good one. And then later in the innovation process, you might need marketing and HR to help you hire. But early on, finance, legal and compliance, IT, maybe to create prototypes. Sometimes I remember at Pearson, we also do a lot of work with branding, like how do you use the logo and how do you represent the company outside and all that. So we did need to get some sign off from there. But those are the ones that come to mind, straight away.
Now, Tenda, with regards to time, I could go on and go on, but before we end this conversation, I have one question. Now, there is one person in a big corporation. They have an idea for a breakthrough innovation. Why should they do this within their corporation and don't leave because of all the obstacles you just talked about and try to make it as their own startup?
Yes. So I'm actually working on an article because this is just a plug, if you don't mind, sir. I've just got my first official masterclass, my personal masterclass that I'm running on the Strategyzer platform. It's the Pirates in the Navy masterclass. And it's a masterclass for corporate innovators that are wanting to navigate the environment, like how do they change the environment, heads of innovation leads, innovation teams. And I'm writing a piece right now to try and promote that masterclass. And the first section of the piece I'm writing is why it's better to be a pirate in the Navy rather than just a pirate, right? And I think that in our culture, we celebrate entrepreneurs a lot. These guys are iconic: Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, all these people, right? And everybody, it's cooler to be a startup founder than it is to be a corporate innovator.
Exactly.
It's so different, right? But what I often say to people is that, like, the easiest thing for a startup is getting started. Because you're the founder, you don't have to get your line manager to approve. You don't have to get funding from finance or whatever. You can just get started. Like, there's no restrictions in terms of starting. So as a startup founder, the early stages of startups are much better for the startup than they are for the corporate startup, right? But if the corporate startup can survive the early stages, they have more advantages at the scaling phase than a startup does.
Yes.
Right? Because at the scaling phase, they got access to customers, access to brand, access to marketing, access to talent, access to global networks. If it's a manufacturing idea, they have access to value chains that a startup can only dream of. Right? And so the job of the corporate startup is to survive the early stages. And then they can get access to all the benefits of being a corporate innovator. And these are things that startups would pay money for the access to customers that corporate startups have. And so then the question is, what's the price to pay for the corporate startup? The price to pay is relationship building. That's the price you pay. And if you don't want to pay that price, then Alex Osterwalder calls you a startup in chains, i.e., you don't want to, you're acting as if you're outside when you're inside. So you don't have the benefits of an actual startup, but you also don't have access to the advantages of being in a large company. And so you're just like a startup in chains. If you're not that kind of person, yeah, if you're not that kind of person, then you might as well go out and do your own startup, and then be ready for the scaling struggle. Embrace it and say that that's what I want. Or you say, you know what, I'm happy with the early stage struggle because I'm getting my salary paid, and then later on at the scaling phase, I can leverage the startup. I want to say something that's a first principle because it just landed in my head. You know how like things sound paradoxical sometimes? Like, how can you hold two opinions that are different at the same time? The way you do that is understanding when what applies.
Exactly.
When does a startup have advantages and when does a corporate startup have advantages? And then you start navigating and living in the world that you are with the right behaviors and practices that are important for being where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. It is context specific, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I think one thing that would be also interesting is whether organizations manage to create the incentives financially for those corporate innovators to stay and scale those ideas. Now,
So can I get that before you
go ahead. I have time. I want to be mindful of your time.
So there's a bank in the Netherlands, one of the 4 or 5 large banks in the Netherlands, and for their innovation lab, this was the incentives that they did was if you applied to join the lab, you would get seconded from your job as a team to join this innovation lab for 3-6 months, whatever, and you would take a 50% pay cut in exchange for a stake in your idea.
That's good.
If your idea succeeded. So now it's almost like an entrepreneurial incentive system where you got skin in the game.
You take a risk.
Yeah. And in exchange for that, the organization gives you a stake in your idea. Now, of course, it's not real skin in the game because if the idea fails, you can still go back to your job. But, it's at least something in terms of trying to incentivize innovators.
I think that's something to explore. Now, Tendayi, maybe we can get some time on your calendar at another point in time and continue this conversation. You don't have to commit right now in front of everyone, but I really want to thank you for taking the time today. I learned so much again, and I'm sure the people watching this live or also later when we share the recording will definitely benefit a lot from your experience and from your insights. Thank you so much, Tendayi.
Cool, man. Thank you.